I don't know if it's going. It's going. You are listening to or watching Strangers in Space, and for the next 60 minutes, we are going to be talking about Doctor Who, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hello, I'm Lee.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Simon.
And so we are in January of 2022, and this month we decided was going to be the kickoff of our music club strand on the podcast feed, which we accidentally started a couple of months early and have already had 4 episodes of. Who knew? But anyway, so we decided that we were going to have a sort of music themed month, which doesn't mean that everything that we do this month will be music themed, but that there will be a fair bit of music themed stuff this month. And as it's a subject I'm not sure we've ever really covered, and as it's a subject I didn't want to go into massive amounts of homework and detail and research and stuff about, but I really would quite like to do this just as a sort of memory thing, as a sort of what did you get the feeling of thing. I thought we'd talk about what the hell Simon's up to.
I'm trying to sort my light out.
Calisthenics.
He wants to look good for the video recording, right? So he's left the room. So we are going to. So now that Simon's back, we are going to talk. We're just going to talk about music in Doctor Who, how we think, whether we think it works, whether we like it, and so on and so forth. Simon, sit down. Stop faffing around.
Somehow I managed to make it worse.
Are you ready for your close-up, Mr. Brett?
I thought the last episode we did was bad enough for interruptions, but this is unforgivable.
It's taken all your acne off, which is great.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know what's
I'll stick with this. It's the I don't know what look it is.
Well, you can't see anything. You're just a white spot in the middle of the screen, but you know that'll do, I guess.
It's like the Black Guardian or whatever.
Lee,
some weird scene out of the beginning of the Key to Time.
Lee looks like he's been turned into an ultra SD video effect. I don't know what's going on there, Lee. And this is
SD, ultra SD, isn't it HD?
No, the opposite of HD. You're really in standard def.
It's like bad.
Oh, you're pixelating like crazy. Don't worry, it looks fine. It looks better than any of the rest of us, to be honest. Yeah. Music in Doctor Who. I guess 3 of us grew up. So I don't want necessarily to do this chronologically.
3 of us grew up.
3 of us grew up.
One of us hasn't yet.
Well, anybody
one of
like
these kids is doing his own thing.
3 of us grew up with the music of Dudley Simpson, didn't we? Essentially. Is that? I take it are those the first musical memories we had of Doctor Who? I know when I was watching Doctor Who in the sort of Hinchcliffe era and sort of slightly before and obviously immediately afterwards, I was very aware of what the music was doing in Doctor Who at this time. Lee, Simon, were you aware of music that early? Or I'm guessing, Simon, maybe you became a little bit more aware of the music as we went into the 80s.
I guess the thought that somebody was actually creating the music that was being used on. I mean, obviously the theme is there from the start, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean that is etched into our memories from probably the age of about 2 or 3. I would have thought. Even just hearing it on, not even knowing which TV program it comes from, just that theme is enough, isn't it?
Which is terrifying, and everybody knows how scary it is when you're a kid and you hear that scream into it.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, you
the
and
scream.
Me, go on.
Oh, I was going to say the scream really started in 1980, didn't it? With or 1981 with the Howl theme. I'm not sure the scream was anything like the same prior to that.
No. I mean, the version I'm assuming we all know would have been the classic tunnel theme.
Yeah, the Tom Baker version.
Late John. Did they change it from Pertwee to
It was
Baker?
Pertwee's last season into start of Tom Baker, but of course it ran for 6 of the 7 Tom Baker seasons, and that's the one that most people of our generation have as the sort of defining memory of their sort of childhood Doctor Who watching.
Mm.
Yeah, no, I remember Dudley Simpson's music vividly. I think Seeds of Doom rather, and Talons of Wayne Chiang and Robots of Death. Yeah, all quite quite interesting because it's science fiction, but it had this strange orchestral, orchestral jolly quality to it. It was almost playful and jazzy and odd and atonal in places. So it does stick with you.
And the
Whereas,
I was going to say the weird thing about it for me is it wasn't quite orchestral. So, and obviously Star Wars was coming along at this time, and we were going to the pictures to see these things. And the music of John Williams was something that you'd hear on the radio at least, and props on the telly as well in adverts and stuff. So the orchestral thing was becoming a thing around the time that I was starting to notice what the music in Doctor Who was. But the weird thing about the Dudley Simpson stuff is it wasn't quite orchestral. It was chamber. It was an orchestra, but it was a chamber orchestra. So it had this really weird quality that was quite unique and was unlike anything else that you'd be hearing.
And it was different to other sci-fi TV, even early Doctor Who in itself, because it was much more electronic and experimental then. And if I remember right, other sci-fi TV, apart from Blake Seven, which is also Dudley Simpson, was kind of like playing with electronics to give you that feeling of outer space. Whereas he just didn't bother, did he? It's really quirky sounding music. Whereas when the 80s came, and me and Simon remember those probably more vividly, that kind of electronic sound was quite nice and full in the early 80s, but then dwindled a bit and became a bit emptier as the decade went on, it felt.
It's
to me
odd
anyway.
because,
to me anyway.
Because I was well into my music, from an early age, I was listening to a lot of, greatest hits albums, and probably one of those albums that you'd buy by K-Tel, where it wasn't actually by the original artist. So I was listening to a lot of those, but I don't remember making, apart from the theme music, I don't remember making the connection with music being involved in Doctor Who. I think it was all part of the experience. And because, as you say, Lee, it was so atonal, I didn't necessarily pick it up as being music, if that makes sense. It's not like, we had the comedy shows at the time, which in general were all done by Ronnie Hazelhurst. All of those very, as you say, plinky plonky, telling you when the quirky bits are, and aren't these silly people. But I don't remember picking up on it from things like Doctor Who. And it was only when Star Wars came along where the music almost became a character in its own right that I picked up on it.
Yeah,
probably because of the melody, but
so like the droids or the Jawas, that it's got a personality to it that's connected to the characters. In Doctor Who, we know we've got things like the Master's theme and all of that, but it's not really pointed out that that's the Master theme. It's just like every time you see him, that pops up, and you think, and then you start hearing it, but it's not immediate. Although there are a couple of funny bits in Seeds of Doom with the funny woman who's trying to buy a painting or flog a painting.
Emilia Ducat.
And you get a few moments of type things going on in the background, but
The other strange thing is that I was educated by my father in things like the Moog synthesizer, and we had an album called The Electric Coconut, which was all Moog versions of things like Popcorn, and and Chirpy Chirpy Cheep Cheep and things like that. But again, I didn't make that connection between synthesizers and what was being done on Doctor Who. It's only in later years that you realise there's this whole heritage that goes right the way back through.
Is there something about the music in Doctor Who isn't supposed to stand out when you watch it initially? So with the new series, I don't notice the music when it's on, but because I've seen Pyramids of Mars about 25 times now, I know all the music, and the music sticks in my head. I know the music from City of Death now, and that goes round and round in my head, and I know the lyrics to that music.
City of Death kind of borrows quite heavily anyway, doesn't it, from Gershwin? So it's kind of already a recognisable, certainly a tone and a rhythm, if not the actual melody, but the melody's not far removed. Matt, I was going to ask you, because you're I didn't want to leave you out entirely, Matt.
No,
I wanted to get these two going first. What I wanted to say was, because we'll talk about the 80s in a moment, but I kind of wanted to do this section on Dudley Simpson in the 70s before we got there. But for you would have come to this music by going backwards to it from the 1980s on video mostly, having been watching the 1980s stuff go out live. So so the interesting perspective I wondered about was, did it feel like a bit of a shock to the system, having grown used to 1980s synthesizer Doctor Who, to then go back and find these videos with this Dudley Simpson music on? Did it seem weird at all?
Not really, because actually it wasn't videos that. So Dudley Simpson sounds pretty much the same all the way through. He's a fairly consistent composer.
Yeah.
I had the Genesis of the Daleks soundtrack on cassette, and I'd listened to that before I had any videos repeatedly over and over again. So by the time I did get Pyramids of Mars was the first video I got, I recognized the music immediately as being Doctor Who-ish. Right. So I had and also I didn't really pay attention to the music the first times I was watching these videos, and by the third time it was the music, so I sort of settled into it. Yeah, so it didn't impact on me mainly.
So from the 1970s, let's go backwards, because although we'd have experienced the 80s before, let's talk a bit about watching videos of older stuff and going backwards and then hearing some of the weird stuff that was going on in the 1960s or the early 1970s as well. You know, the Sea Devils, Ambassadors of Death even, has got a really distinctive set of melodies, hasn't it? And then in the 1960s, you've got a lot of bought-in music and stock music, Les Structures Sonores, and so on and so forth. So Lee and Simon, I guess, are the slightly more music head ones. But I mean, Matt, you must have experienced this too. Going back to some of those 1960s things, the Cyberman theme or the weird atonal stuff that you had in some of the early Dalek stories. Well, what's your memory of how you experienced that? Did you notice even that these were quite different in some cases?
I didn't, particularly the really early stuff, because it sounds like they blend it in with the sound of the Dalek City or the sort of the background sounds really smartly. So absolutely, in a lot of those Hartnell ones, certainly you don't know you're listening to incidental music, and it's sort of moves from kind of weird space sounds into music and back without you even noticing.
Dudley Simpson, interestingly, I didn't realise this, that Planet of Giants was his first one.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to remember, or see if I can try and remember what that sounded like, if it was any different to what was going on before.
I think the first couple of years, the music a lot of the time was quite different. Each story had a sort of distinct quality. Sometimes it would be the same as another story that you'd already had. But I think throughout the 60s, the music kind of went with the story rather than with the series, as it were. So you didn't have, like when Dudley Simpson was scoring it, you kind of had a sort of tone of sound that went with Doctor Who. But in the 60s, you only had a tone of sound that went through a story. And the Planet of Giants one is quite distinctive. That's a little bit jazzy, a little bit percussive, if I remember rightly. We're obviously doing this all from memory. In fact, I think Planet of Giants sits more nicely alongside something like the Ambassadors of Death and City of Death than it does. So maybe it should have been called the Planet of Death, right? Than it does with a lot of the other stuff that Dudley Simpson did. I think Planet of Giants, the Ambassadors of Death and City of Death are his three best scores for my money. And actually, I'm not a huge Dudley Simpson fan. I think, as Matt sort of alluded to, I think it all becomes a bit samey. And although I found it very distinctive, I don't necessarily think distinctive equals good. So, and I know that's a little bit controversial to say, but go on.
Everybody's got their opinion. I mean, he did 60 episodes, didn't he, of Doctor Who, or adventures, I suppose you could say, stories. So that is a lot of work, a lot of which should be repeated over and over again because they're like signature 30-second pieces or whatever, and creating themes for certain people like the Master. It's a lot of work. He was orchestral to begin with, so he came from that background. And to come into Doctor Who and do something that I think is very different to what you would expect the sci-fi world to be like, and it not being necessarily his chamber, well, not a chamber, but his orchestral music that he would have done beforehand, it's really interesting. That is quite distinctive. And I know what you mean about the fact that you could probably listen to 3 in the 70s and go, oh, which episode was that from? Because they're quite similar. But, you know, we're lucky enough now to have silver screen and all these other companies that are releasing music from the series, so we can sit down and really listen, like you would have done, Matt, with Genesis of the Daleks, or or Pyramids of Mars. Even you can go and get the soundtracks and just listen to them over and over again, which is what I did. So
Which is what I will never ever do.
Seeds of Doom, I know it so well. It's this beautiful piece of music, and they're very, very different because of the
that's not
ice
Simpson,
part and the and the jungle bits.
Seeds of Doom's not Dudley Simpson, though, is it?
Isn't it? Who is it?
No, Seeds of Doom and the Terror of the Zygons are. Oh God, his name's gone right out of my head. No,
no, not Kingsland.
No. They were by another composer, and it has been released, so people will know. People listening to this.
I'm talking out my arse then.
Well, yeah, it's not a million miles away from, but Douglas Camfield famously wouldn't work with Dudley Simpson, so all the Douglas Camfield directed ones are scored by other people.
Jeffrey Burgeon.
That's the one.
Oh, Jeffrey Burgeon. Yes, of course.
It's odd. It's odd. It's just occurred to me that the first incidental music in Doctor Who ever is diegetic.
Basically,
pretty much, bar the first scene with the policeman, and then you get the synthesized pop music that the kids are listening to in the corridor.
Yeah.
So all that's talk about Hartnell music being really mysterious and atonal and blending in. The very first bit of noticeable music is very, very explicit and very obvious.
And also stock music again, because it was John Smith and the Common Men, they called it in the series. It wasn't that in real life. It was stock music that was bought in, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, Flight Through Entirety, the podcast, use it as their theme music. Simon, I didn't get to ask you about music from the 60s and experiencing it on video, or however it was that you experienced it, but coming to it afterwards and knowing your love for synthesized music. And so in the 1980s, I'm guessing, we'll get there in a minute, you'd have been happier. But coming back to the 1960s music after you'd been living through the 1980s and all those composers from their radiophonic workshop, what did you make of the music that was on these videos or whatever?
It comes back to this idea that there were times in the 60s when for me, the 1960s Doctor Who is most exciting and most interesting is when it's being treated like a drama like any other. So you've got these, although a lot of it is library music, you've got a lot of these, I'm trying to think from memory, maybe string quartet, proper dramatic music. I mean, it's so different because you seem to have two different modes. You have these pieces of music which do have melody and a structure which is kind of affecting mood, much like we used to with the more recent series. But you've either got that or you've got literally a soundtrack which acts almost like a piece of scenery to remind you that you're in the future. I mean, this is the thing about electronic music, is even now, because it's so synthetic, a lot of this, particularly the analog synthesizers, still sound futuristic when you listen. Either they sound futuristic or they feel like a form of the future that we haven't reached yet and probably never will. That kind of shape of things to come future, with lots of all the noises and strange things that don't resemble any real instruments at all. So you're right that when I look back at those 60s ones, it's odd to hear normally structured music paired up with Doctor Who, so it feels like a proper piece of TV drama as opposed to something which is supposed to take you somewhere else.
Do we know that? Oh, go on.
It's odd. Does it feel like the future still? So I'm thinking with the Doctor Who theme, it starts out being very electronic, and that's futuristic, and then they move in the new series to orchestrated, because the electronic music sounds sort of retrospectively futuristic, but there is also still kind of.
But ironically, that original version of the Doctor Who theme, there's very little synthesis in that whatsoever. A lot of that is structured from real sound, pitched up and down, piano strings plucked and then tuned right down to create that bass line. I think, am I right, Lee, that it's only the ooh is the only actual bit of synthesis in there, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's the only
yeah.
bit of
It's just a lot of looping. It's a lot of Radiophonic Workshop, Delia Derbyshire doing her thing. It is. It's a scraping. The sound of the the TARDIS is the scraping of a key on a piano string. So
That's
yeah,
right.
and you're right. The bass notes are like dropped right down. It's all pretty analog, really, to be honest.
But the ooh 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 is quite an important bit. That is the bit that always sounds futuristic.
And that's the one synthesizer, isn't it? So
yeah.
Well, it's just Delia Derbyshire going ooh. She hasn't told anybody this.
But what she did was she created an ambience. So it's not about what each of the parts is, it's about how they sit together, isn't it?
Yeah.
And she creates all the different bits individually, and each of them is on a separate tape, and the way you get the soundtrack for that bit is by playing the tape backs all together in sync with one another. It's quite an incredible process she went through to get it.
It is, and it's still very original sounding. There's nothing quite like it. And it would have been really interesting to see what Ron Grainer actually had in his head, what he thought it was supposed to sound like.
Well, if you've ever listened to the Radio Free Scaro podcast, you'll find out, because the Radio Free Scaro podcast, and this was a deliberate choice, they start every episode with Ron Grainer's version of his theme tune for Doctor Who.
Okay.
But so this is not a version that he recorded back then, but this is one that he did afterwards with his band after Doctor Who had become a successful program. So this may not be exactly what he had in mind, but it's as close as we'll ever get to knowing what he had in mind. So yeah, you can look it up online. It's on YouTube and places like that as well, I expect. But yeah, Radio Free Scaro start with Ron Grainer's version of his Doctor Who theme tune, and it's basically a piece of jazz music.
Yeah, and it's something like James Bond. The very famous few notes came from another piece that he was working on, which was to do with an Indian TV show, I think, or something that had an Indian flavour to it. So the ding 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 ding, that's quite an Indian scale or whatever. And then throwing it into James Bond and making it incredibly British sound was quite a clever piece of clever move, and that was with the orchestration coming in. But with Doctor Who, that theme tune is we know it so well, but it's one of the most powerful and iconic pieces of music ever on TV, film, whatever. You will instantly recognize it, even if you played the original theme or the newest themes.
The Doctor Who theme's really not that dissimilar from the James Bond theme, is it? Instead of ding 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 ding, you've got ding 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 ding, and instead of what's the Bond one? Ding 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 ding, you've got ooh, ooh.
Yeah.
So it's really quite similar. So yeah, and they both happened at more or less the same time.
Exactly.
So it's probably not quite an accident that they're that similar, and it's probably a good thing that Delia Derbyshire took it away from what Ron Grainer had written, because if they'd kept with what Ron Grainer had written, the similarities might have been more apparent.
Imagine if she'd have been given Steptoe Son.
Well, you can hear her doing all sorts of other things, and obviously not versions of things like Steptoe and Son, but a lot of the stuff that she would have done over the years would have been, basically in the same ballpark as what her version of that theme would have sounded like. So you could probably imagine what she'd have made of that.
Made from the sounds of scrap metal being hit and.
Yeah, exactly.
Were we aware that in the 1960s? I believe this is the case. Obviously, I say we're just basically doing this from memory and stuff, so I couldn't swear to it entirely. But the music was played in the studio live as they were acting the show. Now, I don't think it was playing into the studio so that they could hear it, because that would be picked up from the microphones. But what I mean is they were recording the music to the soundtrack as they were recording the episodes. I've never heard of that. Really? I'm pretty sure that's the case. Are we all looking at me blankly?
It may have been. It may have been for other shows as well, but I'm not entirely sure, actually. Yeah, maybe.
I'm fairly sure that was standard. They'd have the music.
They had a tape machine to the side of the studio and they played it
in so they could record the soundtrack live as they were recording the pictures, because that's how they did it then. I'm pretty sure at that end of the television scale.
Yeah, because aren't there some moments where there's kind of some false starts with the music where it kind of cuts in and then stops again?
And of course, famously, and this is not because of the music, but it's an example of how the whole thing was put together, they had to go back and re-record the first episode of the Daleks because of all the background noise that was bleeding through onto the soundtrack, and they decided that it was just such a bad job they'd have to go back and redo the episode, at which point they were able to go back and remake the model of the Dalek City as well. So I don't know if you're aware, as a tangent, that there's two versions of the Dalek City. There's the version that they got initially from the model makers, which wasn't really what they had in mind. And when they came to re-record the episode, because they were doing it like 4 or 5 weeks later, they were able to go back to the model makers and say, pull your finger out. And so they came back with something rather better. So yeah, somewhere destroyed, sadly, there's a version of the very first episode of the Daleks with a different soundtrack and a different Dalek City. But yeah, for me, that's one of the things about music in the 1960s, especially the very early days, is that I think you can tell when somebody's pressing play on a tape recorder and when somebody's pressing stop on a tape recorder. I think there's a whole issue with the editing that's probably fascinating to watch, where scenes are paced to make sure they finish where the music finishes, where the music cue would stop, and where other scenes are paced so that they'll start with the music cue and stuff like that. This goes for sound effects too, because I think the same thing was happening with sound effects as well, pretty much. I think if you watch it looking for this kind of stuff, there's some really weird pacing issues in 1960s Doctor Who, and I think there's some really weird pacing issues in 1960s Doctor Who anyway, given what kind of television it is and how it was being made anyway. I find it a lot easier to watch 1960s Doctor Who because of all this as a kind of, I don't know, academic exercise, rather than sitting there being entirely drawn into the storylines and the narrative. I find it harder to sort of, empathize with the characters than I do just to follow what the people making the program are doing as much as anything else, which includes the music. And I've got to say, the entire classic series, Cards on the Table, I'm not really a fan of any of the music at any stage. Which is not to say that I don't enjoy bits. Ambassadors of Death, I think the music's terrific. And the Cybermen theme. Who doesn't like that, right? As crap as it may be. And it is pretty crap, let's be honest. But yeah, I think, generally speaking, from 1963 to 1989, Doctor Who music is kind of defined by its naffness.
There's nothing wrong with the macra. I mean, the whole of that episode.
Isn't that purposefully irritating though?
It is.
That's
so
meant
good.
to be. It's meant to be annoying.
It is, but I find the whole of music in Doctor Who, pretty much from the start to the end of the classic series, just to be rather naff and a little bit irritating at times. I think because it's Doctor Who, I kind of go, well, I just love it anyway. And to be honest, with this amount of perspective on it now, I've got a lot more love than irritation for it. But the music in Doctor Who was really distinctive and I really noticed it, but I never noticed it in a, oh, that's good kind of a way. I've never been a fan of it.
Actually, the whole Doctor Who sound effects album for me was more interesting than a lot of the music. It was a lot of music was so sparse, wasn't it? I mean, I love things like the Sea Devils, but it's only because I can sit there listening to the sound of analog synths all day anyway. So it's just
that's quite a grating soundtrack, though, isn't it? It's really in your ear. Well, no spoilers, but I hope they come back with that music.
The Sea Devil walks in. You don't see below the neck that he's holding a stylophone.
There's a whole load of it behind me going.
No Rolf Harris.
But the sound effects LP. Could you put that on and listen to it for pleasure?
No, I mean no one ever did they? Did you put it on?
Simon's got an expression on his face.
I've got this long and distant look. Certain ones, I found it fascinating to hear these things in isolation. I think it's the same as hearing the Beatles albums stripped down to their various tracks and hearing them on their own for a bit is where the fascination comes in. No, it's not listenable. in the traditional sense at all. But I think as a piece of history and to hear how they did it, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
I've got to say though, I had the same effect, the same impact from the music albums they put out. So the first one would have been at the 20th anniversary, I think. I think that was the first time they put out a music album, and it was a compilation mostly of recent things, with, if I remember rightly, a couple of older things. And I did buy it just as I bought the sound effects album, because an album of Doctor Who music. But it went on my record player precisely once, and at the end of the experience of listening to it, I took the knife back out of my hand, put the LP back in its sleeve, and never went anywhere near it ever again, frankly.
So was this the one with the Five Doctors and the
Yeah.
King's Demons and Meglos and all of that stuff?
Mm.
And
I think
probably
dotted in
And
amongst
a
there, though. I mean,
sweet-
it's
yeah. I
dotted
think
amongst
it
there.
had
There are some nice pieces of music,
Yeah,
though. I
I
do
think so.
really like a lot of the Five Doctors music, but maybe that's through repetition because it's one of the stories I've probably watched the most repeated times.
apart from the
So
horns.
yeah. No, they're not so bad, but so okay, let's talk about the 80s, because I think that's the one bit that we all really experienced as it went out, right? And probably have the greatest memories of, whether they're good memories or bad. So for me, the 1980s suffers from a lot of the same stuff as Dudley Simpson did, which is there's lots of scales and things that sound like they might be about to be a melody, but there's not a lot of actual melody. And there's, for all that there are sort of like 6 instruments happening at the same time while Dudley Simpson is doing it, there's not a lot of counterpoint melody. They're either doing the same thing or they're doing things one after another, but you rarely, unless it's percussion, you rarely get 2 or 3 instruments happening at the same time, doing counterpoint things with each other and actually making harmonies and stuff like that. There's very little of that. When you get to the 80s, I find exactly the same effect from the composers there, except now they're on really thin, reedy synthesizers, which for me made it feel even worse than it was before. So for all that really famous piece of music at the end of Legopolis, when you're about to have the regeneration, all it is a scale, a downward scale repeated over and over again, and then a bit of a fart at the end. And that's, but which is by way of saying I don't hate this stuff, but I still found the whole of it just really, I always found the music from Doctor Who kind of naff, and I did with that too.
I think it's quite evocative now. I think it's certainly, because it's so distinctive, it's very evocative of the time. And particularly those synthesizers, that FM synthesis does give a very thin and almost metallic sound of these things, which are essentially trying to pretend to be real instruments. And that's why it doesn't quite have that futuristic feel. It does feel otherworldly because it's like stuff sounds we know, but not quite how they should be, if that makes sense. I mean, it's
they do sound pretty crap though, don't they, Simon?
Yeah, they do. I mean, sometimes it works, and as I say, the evocative. I think some of those like flute sounds that they use a lot, where they do the scales, like you say, JR, they're very much of their time, and they give me quite a warm feeling because that kind of season 18 feeling of things being slightly fresh, but slightly wrong as well. I mean, you know, I'm assuming that when Star Wars came along and everything went big and they're using full orchestras to work with the film, they couldn't do that. So they thought, to hell with it, we'll go the other direction, which is to make it as synthetic as possible. But then I think you get that kind of uncanny valley effect, but in music form instead, because it's electronic instruments trying to sound like real instruments, which is not. I don't think it's a nice feeling.
No, it's not a nice feeling, that's for sure. I
Well,
mean, when
then you get weird things like the Mordrin Undead stuff, where the car chase in Mordrin Undead is scored with the most bizarre piece of pseudo piano sort of 1930s style. You know, it's just, what the hell is anybody thinking?
If they brought Jeffrey Burgon in to do Mordrin Undead, Jeffrey Burgon did Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So he would have been perfect for Mordrin Undead, that lifts whole scenes from Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Matt, what did you think of music in the 80s?
I mean,
were you noticing it?
there's a white elephant. There's an elephant in the room that I am unironically and unapologetically a fan of the McCoy music because of the 25th anniversary. Before that, I think it's fairly dull and kind of bland. But I genuinely think that it lifts up with the McCoy three McCoy seasons, and I genuinely think it becomes kind of quite catchy. And that might be because I've just listened to it on this album repeatedly.
Well, I know I've got a theory about the McCoy era, and it's a theory that goes hand in hand with what Andrew Cartmel was doing. And I think it's something we should get to in a couple of minutes. But pre-McCoy, the 1980s, didn't work for you?
No. It worked perfectly for me because I didn't notice the music, really.
Yeah, fair enough.
I watched it and it just blended in with what I was watching. It became a texture behind the story, because you weren't supposed to listen to the music or notice the music. You were supposed to be paying attention to the story, and the music was supposed to, as Simon says, move between a texture that kind of made you feel something and occasional stings to make you aware that something dramatic has happened. So no, I didn't really notice the 80s music that much. And also, as I'm watching it, again, you're watching it once without any repeats. So it's only when you start to watch it on video that it kind of gets under your skin. But then again, at some point, I started recording it off the television. So I started watching it repeatedly, having recorded it off the television. I think I recorded 5 Doctors off the television on a very early video recorder. But after that, it was just McCoy all the way.
Yeah, my video recording off the telly started with McCoy. Lee, you were going to say?
I quite enjoyed Marquez's stuff, oddly.
Well, let's get to McCoy in a minute, because I do want to go there and have a slight
golden
conversation about that.
Simon's holding his breath.
But pre-McCoy, I don't think. See, it probably sounds like I'm bitching about it and bitching about the people who were composing it. I don't think that's necessarily a fair thing to say, because I think there are different pressures at hand. These guys are all doing an awful lot of stuff for an awful lot of different things. And Doctor Who did always and has always relied on mood as much as anything else. So oftentimes they were composing for a mood rather than for something that would sort of pass muster as a record in its own right. So when I say I listened to the album and never went anywhere near it again, yeah, fair enough. But to be honest, that music wasn't composed to be listened to in that way. So there's no reason why it should work in that way. And that it did work for some people, it's obviously to that music's credit. So I think that my issues with the music in the 60s and in the 70s and in the 80s aren't with the music itself, but with the fact that because it was so distinctive, was listening to it in a way that it probably didn't really deserve listening to. And so this brings me to the McCoy era. And what I wanted to say is, because there's not a massive sea change here at this point, but definitely when Andrew Cartmel comes in, he definitely is the first person to look at Doctor Who as a cultural artifact and write it as if he knows that it's something that's going to stand the test of time. So the stories that Andrew Cartmel oversees are stories that know they're going to live going forwards. And that's not just because they exist on people's home video recordings and they're going to be watched repeatedly. And it's not just because VHSs of these stories are starting to be released in the shops, but it's also because there's now a magazine all about it. There are various fan groups and a nationally organized fan group. There's a range of books that's by this point been around for over a decade. Andrew Cartmel, I think, is the first person who comes into the job who actually recognizes that this is a job that's going to be under greater scrutiny than anybody else. And I think he oversees a Doctor Who that's written knowing that it's going to have that scrutiny. But I think this passes down through the rest of the staff who are working on the programme at the same time. And whatever you think of the music that was produced, and I think largely the problems with the music that was produced are to do with the instrumentation and the production rather than the melodies. But if you look at what Kev McCulloch are doing and what Mark Ayres is doing, that is definitely music that says, okay, I'm here to do a mood, but I'm also here to be listened to in isolation, and I'm strong enough thematically and in terms of melody and counterpoint and all this other stuff I was talking about earlier. Suddenly you get music that works if it's going to be released on an album. And I think the music for the last 3 years of Doctor Who, whatever you think of Time in the Rani and Delta and the Bannermen, whatever you think about Kev McCulloch and his drum rolls and all this kind of stuff, I think it's music that's actually made to be listened to rather than just to sit behind a dialogue or behind some explosions.
Is there also a case, it's sort of a Thatcherite thing, that possibly before Time in Irani, they'd go to the BBC Radiophonic Workshop and the composers were kind of in-house composers, whereas Kev McCulloch and Mark Ayres were freelance composers. And so the stuff they're producing is more, they'd be more keen to make it a calling card of their ability. Yeah. Whereas if you're working for the BBC, you're not going to get sacked if you kind of phone it in, or if you just produce something.
You've got to remember as well that coming through the years, people like Rick Wakeman and probably Mike Oldfield, where you've got these multi-instrumentalists, whatever you call them. Suddenly with the technology, particularly around 1986, I'm thinking of like the Trial of a Time Lord, which was the first series I videoed. And so I remember watching that over and over again, that opening effects scene, because the music in that is really effective. There's a great big massive DX7 tubular bell sound that was used a heck of a lot in Doctor Who, if I remember rightly, this big clanging sound. Suddenly the producers are able to look to one person, and a thing called General MIDI started around that sort of time. So the MIDI language, which basically meant that you could get a 5-pin DIN plug and connect it up between all your synthesizers, and they would all keep time to the same clock. And they would keep time. There would be no straying off of the beat or anything like that. So suddenly they're able to layer and layer and layer and layer and layer to the point, where you got more than 16 instruments at once. So suddenly they got one person they can point at to behave like an orchestra. So they're only paying one person to do something that they would pay a whole string quartet to play. But the trouble with that was that with the limitations of the keyboards, these keyboards are trying to pretend to be real instruments. So you get this kind of clunky sound that sounds like something off a video game or something like that. And also,
you lose a little bit of the idiosyncrasy of having an orchestra made up of 50 or 60 or even just 4 people as well.
You use that ambience. You lose the analog recording, the atmosphere of the recording itself, and you're relying completely on one mind putting together things. And I've got my misgivings on people like Kev McCulloch, because I kind of find it very rigid and a little bit naff. But
do you know what I'd really love to? I'd love to see or hear the score being brought to life by an orchestra, actually, because it would be interesting to see whether Kev McCulloch and Mark Ayres had an orchestrated kind of thought about it.
But then Mark Ayres, I think, had a bit more understanding, and through the years has proved that he has a lot more understanding of how to work with this. But the thing is,
you can, just before you go on, Simon, you can actually go on, I think, on YouTube and other places and find out what Kev McCulloch did outside of Doctor Who, where he was a prog guitarist and played in prog bands, and his music he did outside of Doctor Who you wouldn't believe, given what you hear in Remembrance of the Daleks.
Totally.
And when you listen back to Remembrance of the Daleks and you understand the mind where it came from, I think it gives you a different, I don't like it, but I think it gives you a different appreciation of it.
I was going to say that even from the 60s onwards, though, it's like some of the best music and some of the most original music is a creature of its limitations. That whole thing about limitations breeding invention. So you've got stuff like the original Doctor Who theme, where somebody's taking very basic technology and pushing it to its limits, and then and that creates, God knows what this show. I don't think you can underestimate how much that original theme shaped what Doctor Who became and how it kind of seated itself in people's minds. But then, like as I say, in the mid 80s, you've got these keyboards that are trying to pretend to be real instruments and making it very easy for musicians to put together music, multi-layered music. So they're not having to experiment. They're just sort of saying, oh, this is where we're going to have a bit of strings. This is where we're going to have a piano. Oh, look, there's a button that says piano. Click. Let's play all the presets. So there's never a reason for them to experiment and start, to make them do something they're not designed to do, and therefore it kind of sits very safe and very clinical. But I do, as I say, people like Mark Ayres took a lot of that stuff, and there's a lot more texture to his work, and a lot more depth, I think. But he's proved over the years that he's far more of an audiophile, I think, as opposed to a musician. So with his work on the soundtracks and cleaning up the soundtracks, he approaches it in a slightly more scientific way, I think, which probably worked to the benefit of using that equipment.
But this was something in the 80s that I felt suffered with a lot of pop music as well, that you had a period where production, they could save money by doing it all themselves, but it lacked that depth, that kind of like mastering, that the whole analog thing, going through anything analog made it fatter and bigger sounding. And you can go back to the 70s and listen to something that's very basically recorded, but it sounds much better, more warmer than say
just
something
as an
in the
example
80s.
The difference between Boney M and Milli Vanilli, because they were both produced by the same people, but Boney M sounds amazing, and Milli Vanilli sounds terrible.
Yeah, it does, over compressed and all, but it's the same sort of thing though, isn't it? I mean, like, that's why I thought it'd be interesting to grab hold of a score and then then redo it. I mean, my son's on a composing course and he's doing a degree in it, and we were sitting down the other day looking at all kinds of things that he was doing and rescoring something else or whatever, and one of his jobs was to take a score that was already written, and you could just literally copy and paste it into Logic, which is the program he uses, and that would be okay, and you'd almost pass. But you wouldn't completely, because what you need to do is the subtle nuances of everything and putting reverb in and giving it the depth and moving the instruments back and forth, and you're mastering and remixing it. And that's what that seems to be missing in the 80s. There was it's so flat, there's no depth to it at all, I don't think.
Without going into detail, it's like the whole auto-tune argument, isn't it? There's a really good YouTube video where it talks about Michael Bublé, who now uses auto-tune in his live performances.
What?
Yeah, honestly. This is on a TV show, and the only reason they pick up on it is because the auto-tune goes wrong halfway through the performance, and they switch it off, and suddenly his performance is so much more human. But it's so subtle. But it's the difference between the notes. It's where his voice is traveling between notes, instead of moving smoothly between the notes and being slightly off, and having that human organic sound.
Jazz.
There are steps, and you can look at the waveform and you see jagged steps between the notes.
Yeah.
Where it's trying to guess which it's taking the note
itself
and moving it to the closest perfect note. And I've heard it in his songs, and I thought, surely Michael Bublé doesn't use autotune, because I could hear it on the radio.
Right.
And it's almost too perfect. It almost, for me personally, I don't know if I'm sensitive for it, I almost get a certain little sicky feeling, because it's almost too perfect. If that makes sense.
There's some radio stations where you listen, you have it on at work or whatever, and every voice is auto-tuned and every instrumentation is compressed, and they compress it so that the quiet bits don't disappear in the workplace or whatever, where people are listening on the radio or in the car. But because it's compressed like that, everything does start to sound the same, and because the voices are all auto-tuned, they do lose those nuances and idiosyncrasies that says it's a human being. And the trouble with that is, it does start to become a bit samey. And bringing this back to Doctor Who, I think even in the later 1980s, because the instrumentation and the production they were using, it did still sound a bit samey, even when they were, as we say, when people like Mark Ayres were coming in and doing it to a greater degree, much more thoughtfully. It still sounded like 1980s Doctor Who, which I think for me was the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Look, guys, at the risk of going on for 2 hours, and at the risk of angering the viewers and listeners by underrunning on our 60 minutes instead of overrunning as we usually do, shall we actually do this in 2 halves and do the modern era as an episode unto itself later in the month?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, until we come back to do that, I'm actually going to put you all very quickly on the spot, and this is not something that you were expecting me to do, but nominate a favourite soundtrack. I'll go first because I kind of figured a couple of minutes ago I was going to do this, so I had time to think of the answer for myself. But just nominate one soundtrack from the classic series that does stick out or that you do particularly enjoy. And for me, I'm probably going to say, maybe The Invasion, but probably The Ambassadors of Death, because I do like music that sort of hybridizes a bit. So The Ambassadors of Death is not a pure jazz soundtrack, but it leans into jazz with a sort of spy-fi feel. And so it's a sort of pop, jazz, rock sort of soundtrack. And I do like music that kind of leans into different influences at the same time. Hence my love of the Blow Monkeys, as regular listeners will have gathered in the past. That's one of the main reasons for that. So probably for me, The Ambassadors of Death. I don't know. Somebody stick your finger up if you're ready to give me an answer. Matt will give me an answer.
I think it's Mark Ayres, and I think it's Ghostlight for me. Because watching Ghostlight, it's partly because I think the story is so dense and the performances connect with the story, and actually the music bleeds in and out of the story. So you get things, diegetic music, you get undiegetic music moving in and out, and it all works together. I agree. It's probably flat. If I had an ear for music, I'd probably find it flat. But I think it's appropriate. I think it works for.
I think it has texture. I think it has texture, and that's why it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lee, if you want to nominate.
Yeah, I love Dudley Simpson. He did 60 odd stories, but I was talking about the Seeds of Doom. Jeffrey Burgess. That's my favourite. I think it's because we've got a 2-parter and a 4-parter mixed together, so you've got the best of almost 2 episodes in one, and it's very classic B-movie sounds going on.
I like his music for Terror of the Zygons. Actually, he did. Well,
it was a toss-up because Terror of the Zygons is so good as well, but I think it's just the fact that it plays with the Scottish theme a little bit, and it's a bit too cheesy in places. But but definitely Seated of Doom is mine.
Finally, then Simon.
I'll have to go back to the Five Doctors. I mean, it's not. I know
it's going to go for Delta and the Bannermen, Matt.
Oh yeah, tempted, especially the faux 60s stuff. That's brilliant. It's got that horrible, almost cardboard synth sound to it, but I do feel like that when working with those sounds, they're trying to really push them to create atmosphere and texture, and there's some really nice melodies going on, particularly like in the where is it they go for a bit of peace.
Ivor
Ryan. Yeah, that whole scene, that piece of music is gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. So and I do think that because it was the special Five Doctors, I think they probably took a little bit longer over it. So therefore it works really well, and and I'm immediately transported back to when it was first shown on TV.
Fair enough. Now, I'm not going to do that same experiment when we talk about the modern series, given the number of themes that turn up across multiple stories. But we will come back later in the month, and we'll talk about the differences and the similarities in the modern series. Until we do that, I was JR.
I was Lee.
I was Matt.
I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.